Good evening and welcome to the American Academy in Berlin. My name is RJ McGill. I am the head of communications here at the Academy and the editor of our Berlin Journal. You are here tonight, as you know, for Amy Waldman's lecture, Schneepalast, An Emotional History of Snow. As you may have surmised from the title, Amy will be talking about snow. When we were planning her lecture here way back in July, she said, I would love to do it towards the end of the semester because maybe there'll be snow here in Berlin. And for those of you who have lived here long enough, you know that that was an impossible request. And we actually planned the snow for next week, which apparently we have the power to do. So maybe you can come back and see another lecture that's not about snow at the end of that week. In any case, I will say a few words about the Holtzbrinck Fellowship, which is Amy's fellowship, and a few words about her, and then hand over the floor. It was established in 1999 with the generous support of the Holtzbrinck Publishing Group, and the Holtzbrinck Fellowship was created with a specific goal of fostering German-American dialogue in journalism, literature, and scholarship. And as we reiterate each year, or each time there is a fellowship and a Holtzbrinck Family Fellowship, we thank them for their continued support, particularly to Stefan von Holtzbrinck, a long-standing Academy trustee and our current vice chairman. His generosity makes so much possible here, including every issue of the Berlin Journal, which features in the current issue, as its editor, I get to do this, Amy's article, Snowman, which you can pick up in the lobby and have a read. Over the years, the Holtzbrinck Fellowship has brought to the Academy American journalists and writers such as the late Joan Acocella, Alex Ross, Alec McGillis, George Packer, Christina Rivera Garza, Liana Fink, and of course, Amy Waldman. Amy is the author of two critically acclaimed novels, The Submission, which explores themes of prejudice, national identity, and collective trauma in post-9/11 America, and A Door in the Earth, which follows an Afghan-American student whose journey to a rural Afghan village exposes the unintended consequences of Western humanitarian intervention. Amy's writing has appeared in an array of publications, from T, the New York Times Style magazine, to The Atlantic and The New Yorker, to Travel and Leisure and the Boston Review, among many others, and has been featured in the anthology Best American Non-Required Reading, which of course is often better than the required reading that one would otherwise read. A former reporter for the New York Times, Amy spent 3 years as co-chief of their South Asia Bureau and also served as a national correspondent for The Atlantic. She's taught journalism at Princeton University and at New York University's Arthur L. Carter School of Journalism. Amy has received fellowships from the Radcliffe Institute, McDowell, and Art Omi. I learned today that it's pronounced Oh My, because there's art that you say Oh My about on the premises, which I did not know. Among others, I'm sure, but those are three. Amy's current project, about which you'll hear in about 60 seconds, is a creative nonfiction book that explores the material and emotional consequences of the loss of snow and what that will mean for humanity. Through history, philosophy, science, and memoir, she examines how humans have adapted to, been inspired by, and now imperil this once abundant element of nature, given that snow is a deeply woven material in our visual, culture, and environmental history. Particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, Amy asks specifically what it will mean to lose this, quote, inanimate substance that has for millennia been so alive in our minds and cultures. And we are very curious to hear your thoughts. Amy will speak for about 35 minutes. After that, we'll go on stage and I'll ask a few questions and then open it up to the floor. If you're in the room, simply raise your hand. If you're watching us online on Vimeo, please type your answers, not your answers, your questions would be good. Amy will do the answers. You guys do the questions. We'll just switch it up a bit this time. Type that into the Q&A and we'll hope to get to them. And with that, Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, RJ, very much for that introduction. I just want to point out it's been reported to me snow in Munich yesterday or today. So got some snow. I want to thank, of course, the American Academy, the trustees, and also the staff for creating and maintaining this haven, from the kitchen, amazing, to the program staff, to which I'm very grateful to the librarians who have proved that there is no book that cannot be found somewhere in this incredible library system. Thank you all. And to my fellow fellows, a warm, inspiring, and deep thinking group who have been the best companions in a very strange time to be abroad, and particularly to Zachary Shore, our collective consigliere, and to my family who was here with me. So I'm going to start with a short clip. Oh no, wait, let's go back there. Okay. No. No. But it captures, in addition to obviously being a major moment in filmmaking history, it captures one of the simplest aspects of snow's appeal, which is fun, to use the technical term. Snow makes adults behave like children, as we more often should. How extraordinary is it that the material for this just falls to earth from the sky? You can't order it, you don't need to buy it, it's freely available, but it can't be summoned. Falling snow is a prime example of what the sociologist Hartmut Rosa calls the uncontrollability of the world. And this, he argues, is why it resonates so profoundly with us. This is just a random picture I took in an extremely intense period of snow in Utah. It's a commonplace miracle, a kind of natural poetry. To wake after a night of snow and find the world transformed, light concentrated, sound muffled, time slowed, the blank page. It's like a Sabbath descending on us, a kind of holiness to it. And there's a timelessness too. These photographs were taken by our very own Annette Hornischer in Russia in 1997. But they could have been taken 100 or 200 years before that. It's not all beauty and romance, of course. I'm talking about snow, life as well, but snow. It's also torture, often highly unpleasant. You can't stop it from snowing, even if you want it to. It makes us defenseless, especially because we have evolved no biological adaptations for living in it. It's dangerous.
With terrifying speed, an avalanche can rumble down a mountain slope, burying everything in its path under a lethal blanket of snow.
And it can drive us mad. Apologies, but I have to do this. Here's Johnny. Of course, snow did not evolve to please us or to torment us. It's simply the sign of a healthy Earth, indeed a condition for the relatively stable climate of the past 25,000 years, give or take a few, within whose fluctuations we've been able to exist, to settle, to farm. Snow, which seasonally covers up to a third of the planet, is a frozen reservoir. It stores water, then slowly releases it, supplying water to more than 1 billion people. Glaciers and ice sheets, as a reminder, are simply compressed snow, and new snow, in turn, shields them from the sun and offsets their melt. Snow is an insulator for soil, for plants, for insects and animals through the cold. And being white, it's completely reflective, so it deflects heat away from the earth. At least that's how it's worked until now. So, as alarming as the news is from Washington this week, and it's quite alarming, I would say that the news from Baku, where COP29, I believe, is going on, is worse. 2024 is shaping up to be the hottest year in recorded history. Fossil fuel emissions, which scientists thought might drop this year, are holding steady. I'm really feeling like the Grim Reaper here, but the facts are the facts. Rather than keeping warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, as was the hope, even the New York Times this morning reported we're on a pathway right now to 2.5. I do still have hope. We can discuss this in the Q&A, but it's pretty alarming. There are a lot of great scientists down the road at the Institute for Climate Research, PIK, in Potsdam, and they consider this decade in particular a race against time. There are planetary tipping points we don't want to cross, thresholds when we've done so much damage to the Earth's systems that there's no reversing it. No one knows how close we are to that or if we're already there. So temperatures are rising faster in winter than in any other season. And snow is one element of what's called the cryosphere. All the frozen terrain on Earth, snowfields, ice sheets, glaciers, permafrost. And as global temperatures rise, the cryosphere is shrinking. This is from an exhibit on climate change at the Alpinist Museum, the Alpine Museum in Munich. I don't know if you can hear. Should I play that again just to get the effect? You hear that drip the whole time you're in the exhibition rooms, and it gets under your skin. So does the caption that says the so-called eternal ice has reached its expiration date. It may not surprise you that snow, maybe compared to glaciers, which, well, not easy to measure or easier, snow is a difficult substance to track. It falls in very remote places. It's variable year to year, season on season. Even on a satellite, white clouds may look like snow. And many places in the cryosphere are too hard to reach for sensors to be put in to measure snow. But on the whole, we can say that snowfall, snow cover, snowpack, time for snow to melt once it's on the ground, all seem to be on the decline. Central and Eastern Europe, to take one statistic, the Southwest and Northeastern United States all seem to be losing 10 to 20% of their snowpack each decade. This is a map. Thankfully, RJ called my attention to this. Published yesterday by the Washington Post. This is the US, except I trimmed off the bottom of Florida and Texas. All the sickly yellow areas show where snow is in decline. I should acknowledge that warmer winter temperatures and the resulting decline in snow present a conundrum. They are a sign, when it comes to the climate, that things are getting worse. But the change makes many people feel better. More comfortable outside, less challenged. It's hard to dress for snow, especially, that's another cheering graph about the change in spring snow cover. Sorry, I had to sneak these kids in there. It's hard to dress for snow. There's even more bundled up pictures. And the elderly, any of us really with less snow don't have to worry about shoveling or slipping. The unhoused don't have to worry about freezing. Livestock owners don't have to dig out their corrals. Roads don't have to be salted. In some places, the decline in snow means growing seasons have been extended. New shipping routes through the Arctic will open up. And even on the very petty level in New York, we no longer face, since it barely snows in New York anymore, the highly unappetizing aftermath of dirt and dog waste on slush. Yet, remember, and I, again, hate to be the scold, but it's all interconnected. The warmer temperatures that bring less cold and misery in one place are sucking up enormous amounts of water, then dropping them on places like Valencia, Spain, or Asheville, North Carolina. And while whether it snows in Berlin or New York may not matter much, it does matter whether it snows in the Himalayas or the Sierra Nevadas or the Andes, where life often depends on it. So as RJ mentioned, snow, and you don't need me to remind you, snow is inanimate. It was never alive. But it does feel to me like we're killing something beyond all the damage we're doing to Earth. And maybe that something is a part of ourselves, an emotional habitat where we've been able to locate and give expression to so many of our feelings. This is not the most important aspect by far of climate change, but it's the one I've settled on, maybe as a larger way to think about loss. I should here lay out my bona fides to be addressing this topic, which are scant. I didn't grow up in snow. I have no childhood memories to be nostalgic for. I grew up in Los Angeles. My father was the one with those memories, and they weren't especially happy ones. His parents migrated from Poland to Winnipeg, one of the coldest, snowiest cities on Earth, and he got out as fast as he could. This is a clip from Guy Madden, the great filmmaker of Winnipeg, Bard of Winnipeg.
It must be the sleepiness which keeps Winnipeggers here. If only I can stay awake, pay attention to where I'm going, where I've been, and get out of here. Stay awake. Stay awake. Stay awake.
Sorry about that. So that apparently is why my father did get out. This is another great Winnipeg artist, Marcel Zama, who also left. But it's interesting. His early work is, a lot of it's about snow. A lot of it's also just on figures on white, which he has said is just the prairie in snow, just white, obliterating everything. He did this book called The Last Winter because he had decided to leave Winnipeg, but it was such a bad winter. They were trapped inside for, 6 or 7 months, and they only got through it, he's wrote, by chanting over and over, "The last winter, the last winter, the last winter." So my father left and basically never went back. He never once took us to see snow. He did not romanticize his childhood in the least, but I did. I found it exotic, magnetic even. In a way, I'm living proof of snow's hold on our imaginations. As a child, I fixated on snow in books, the Little House on the Prairie series, The Wolves of Willoughby Chase. It spoke to something in me, clearly a cold, dark part of me, that the perpetual sunshine of California did not. Drama, danger, coziness, I found it all in these books. But that's a good entry to start to think about just how imprinted on literature snow is. There's Snow White and the Snow Queen, Snow Country by Yasunari Kawabata, and Snow by Orhan Pamuk. The Magic Mountain, obviously, by Thomas Mann with its famous snowstorm. Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. The Dead by James Joyce with its incantatory refrain, "The snow is general all over Ireland." The Snowman by Wallace Stevens with its Mind of Winter. And Snow for Wallace Stevens by Terence Hayes. Schwarze Flocken by Paul Celan. Schneepart by Paul Celan. Schneebett by Paul Celan. The Snowstorm by Leo Tolstoy and Master and Man, which derives from it. The Blizzard by Vladimir Sorokin. The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. Winter by Ali Smith. Artists, too, have been obsessed with snow for at least 500 years, starting really with this painting, Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow. Here are a few others. Caspar David Friedrich, who spoke of snow as, quote, "the great white cloth took the symbol of the highest purity under which nature prepares itself for a new life." Hiroshige, whose incorporation of snow and the snow-covered Mount Fuji influenced Impressionists like Monet as they embarked on their own explorations of snow. The Impressionists, this is Monet's The Magpie, one of the earliest, most significant works of snow, who, through careful optical study, found the color in snow and helped us to see it too. Peter Doig, raised in Canada, for whom snow acts as almost kind of a scrim of memory, obscuring the past or whatever's behind it. And of course, there's film. We saw the Lumiere brothers earlier, Citizen Kane, It's a Wonderful Life, Fargo. Even musicians have been touched by snow. There's a Danish composer, Hans Abrahamsen, for whom snow and winter have been thematic preoccupations for decades now. And this is not going to be easy to hear, but it's really interesting to see how he found a way to mimic the sound of walking in snow. I forgot to mention this one. I love this. Another artist, totally different than the others, David Hammonds, who, this is called the Blizzard Ball Sale, where he, on the streets of Manhattan, sold snowballs for $1 a piece. All right, so this is Hans Abrahamson and the mimicking of the sound of walking in snow. Versions of that in piece after piece. And snow is also threaded through the writings and oral histories and myths of non-artists, also known as ordinary people, many of them indigenous, but also migrants coming into or seeing snow for the first time, being ensorcelled by it, being tortured by it, facing the challenges of living in it, and often eking out a living shoveling it. Many new immigrants to the US have done that. All of these works embody not just powerful emotions, but also are changing, sorry to have him staring at you so intensely, and often, I'll go back to the other one, often conflicted relationship to the natural world. Imagine two children setting out on a walk to see their grandparents. They're in the Alps. It's the mid-19th century, or slightly before. This is Bergkristall, a deceptively simple novella by the Czech-Austrian writer Adalbert Stifter, who would influence both Thomas Mann and W.G. Sebald. So in this, two children are crossing from one valley to another to see their grandparents when it begins to snow. Quote, they set their feet on the soft down and eagerly looked for places where it seemed thicker so they could make believe they were already deep in it. There had descended on everything a pervading sense of peace. The pines are prettily flecked. The little girl, who's no doubt seen snow many times, is still transfixed by the flakes landing on her coat, then slowly vanishing. Except soon, the snow is no longer delightful. It's become so thick they can only see the nearest trees. Soon, not even that. Snow blots out footprints instead of recording them. There is total disorientation. On every side was nothing but blinding whiteness, devouring and shrouding everything till there was nothing but the voracious snow. Everything was closed in, so to speak, by a mysterious white obscurity. In some translations, this is a white darkness, which is a great phrase. This is a horror story, but without an evil mother or stepmother, as in the Brothers Grimm, or a monster, as in Frankenstein, or a deranged human, as in The Shining. The snow doing what it does is enough. They do get rescued. Compare this to the story Italo Calvino writes just over a century later, called The City in Winter, about a rural man named Marco Valdo who's come to the city to work. He awakens one morning to a snow-covered world and believes that his own life has been transformed as well. Quote, along the street, making his own path, he felt free as he had never felt before. The city looks completely different. But at work, he is immediately handed a shovel. Shoveling snow is no game, especially on an empty stomach, Calvino writes. But Marco Valdo felt the snow was a friend, an element that erased the cage of walls which imprisoned his life. Of course, this turns out not to be exactly true. By the end, the snow is gone and the walls are back. So maybe the whole 20th century was about this illusion, the illusion that the snow could be conquered, could be mastered, could be made use of, when in fact it was slipping away. It's poignant to me that it's really only in the last century that the love affair with snow really became widespread rather than confined to a relative handful of obsessives. We came to realize that snow was actually something we could play in. People wanted to go be in snow. There was a pretty remarkable man. There aren't very many pictures of him, so I don't have one. James Edward Church, who was an art history and classics professor in Nevada, who in the early 20th century developed a sideline in snow. He absolutely loved it, and he wanted humans to be able to live in harmony with it and to make use of it. So purely as a hobby, yes, this makes me feel like a slacker, he developed a device to measure the water content of snow, which is important so you can predict how much spring melt you'll get, you can predict floods, you can allocate water among different states. This is entirely the basis of how the Western United States developed and around a water system. It all came from a device he invented to measure snow, and he sent young men out to collect measurements as well, all over the Sierra Nevadas. So he's called the father of snow science. He's a whole story in himself, but I also came across an interesting quote from him in 1942. He said, when I started my career, I was the only one going into snow for pleasure. So that was in the early 20th century. And now everyone is. So in less than half a century, something had fundamentally changed, right? And there were a lot of reasons for this. Snow became much more accessible. There were snow trains and chairlifts and better skis. But finally we get to him. There was also this man, Arnold Fanck, who you could say did as much as anyone to popularize snow. He was a German doctor, I'm sure you know about him, for whom, as his grandson said, snow and ice were almost a religion. In 1919, he made a documentary, The Magic, it's generally translated as The Magic of the Snowshoes, even though everybody's on skis, where he and a crew dragged cameras up to 13,000 feet and began to film. And nobody had really done this before. This was a very unconventional film for the time. But once he did, he didn't get enough of it. So it played for 6 months straight, and audiences were rapt. And over the next decade or more, Fanck went on to make a series of fiction films, all of them connected with mountains, with snow and ice, with skiing. They were very popular, and they helped make skiing a mass sport. They really drove the interest and appetite for it. This is a later Fanck film. It's called The White Hell of Pitzpalau, and I want to see if you recognize the actress.
Winterreisen wurden immer beliebter. Winterurlaub sei doppelter Urlaub. 140 Züge.
Oh, no, probably the best actor as well. Anyway, that was Leni Riefenstahl. She was his leading lady in basically all of these films until she moved on to her own filmmaking career, as you all know about, with Adolf Hitler and the Olympia and Triumph of the Will. They had a fraught relationship, to say the least, and Fanck himself was a complicated character. I recently learned that he lived from 1934 to 1953 right down the street at 39 Zandwerder in a villa that had belonged to a Jewish doctor and physician who fled the country in 1933. Fanck then rented it, then bought it under Aryanization, then gave it back in 1953. He resisted joining the Nazi Party, then he gave in. So there's been a long-running debate about whether his films, with their themes of the individual contesting in contest with nature, were proto-fascist. Even the question is a reminder that there are some unsavory strains in our history with snow, this idea of testing yourself against it, proving your manhood or womanhood, and the idea of who it belongs to and who it does not. This was made literal in Austria and then in Germany. Alpine clubs were the first to Aryanize. And the Nazi program Strength Through Joy sent some 7 million people on affordable vacations throughout Germany during the 1930s. This was an effort to control leisure time, but also ensure a strong population. And winter was seen as especially strengthening.
Winterreisen wurden immer beliebter. Winterreisen wurden immer beliebter. Winterurlaub sei doppelter Urlaub. 140 Züge und 70 Omnibusse brachten Urlauber in die schönsten Skigebiete. Allerdings außerhalb der Zeiten, in denen diese Gebiete ohnehin überlaufen waren. Sportlehrer der KdF-Gemeinschaft
all of this
erteilten
draws
Skikurse.
on a long history in Germany, but also in the US, playing its part of race-based theory around winter, stemming from fetishizing Nordic races, and the idea that winter made the white man. There's an even longer tradition of snow being an analog for purity. Just to name one example, the final line of the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket by Edgar Allan Poe is, quote, "And the hue of the skin of the future was of the perfect whiteness of the snow." But this is not about snow. This is about us. Snow, once again, is our mirror. So it's been only a little over a century since Arnold Fanck made that first documentary up on the mountain and set off a new craze for skiing and just for being in snow. It's been a century only since the first Winter Olympics. And yet already in that short span, ski resorts are closing at lower elevations. And most places that have hosted the Winter Olympics no longer have enough snow to do so in future. It's an astonishing rate of change, one that touches on cultures, lifestyles, and livelihoods across the world. So seen this way, the collective body of creative work that I touched on earlier is actually a kind of body, or maybe it's the outline of the corpse on the floor in a crime scene. We're ascertaining all the attributes of the victim, height, weight, tread, perfume, in the absence of the victim itself. All of these creations came out of profound direct contact with snow. Now they bear the timestamp of an era that began when snow became a worthy subject for human contemplation, a worthy material for artists, and ending when snow ceases to be a material at all, which seems where we're slowly headed. So with each generation ahead, the experience of snow, the memory of it will become more attenuated. Like many people in this room, I lived through 9/11, I reported on it, wrote a novel about it, and at some point, as I got older and the audiences I was talking to about my book got younger, I realized that this was not something they had lived through. This was history that they had to learn. That's a natural evolution, if always disconcerting. But I never could have imagined, and really still can't, that future generations might have to learn in a similar way what snow was. They'll be surrounded by it, of course, in TV shows and video games and indoor ski runs and virtual reality, but they will less and less experience it as an uncontrollable gift. For generations coming up now and in the future who will not know snow as we did, who will have a different conception of even if the word is the same, it seems a little cruel to remind them of what it was. It's like saying we ate all the chocolate ice cream, it was delicious, but unfortunately all the factories that make it have shut down. Would you like a picture of chocolate ice cream instead? It seems easier in some ways to let go, to forget. And snow, naturally, offers a metaphor for that too, for what time can cover. In Life and Fate, Vasily Grossman writes of, quote, flakes of silence falling over the remnants of battle. Everything was disappearing beneath it. Guns, the bodies of the dead, filthy dressings, rubble, scraps of twisted iron. This soft white snow settling over the carnage of the city was time itself. The present was turning into the past, and there was no future. But of course, I don't actually believe in letting it go, because otherwise I wouldn't be writing a book about snow, which I really see as an attempt to create one more artifact about it, to say, this was here, we should remember. As you may have heard, we had an election this month. And in its wake, some of us at the Academy have been talking a lot about not just what's going to happen in the future, but what's going to happen to the past. What is happening, all the ways it can be erased, suppressed, buried. Climate breakdown, as I prefer to call it rather than climate change, seems separate from that, but is it really? If we just pretend this happened naturally, or that snow never really existed at all, aren't we once again simply avoiding accountability? So my project is about loss, but it's also an argument against erasure, against forgetting. So finally we come to the Schneepalast, the title of my talk. I was intrigued to find, as I was researching snow in Berlin, that Berlin seems to have been the site of the very first effort, there may be others I don't know about, but the one that I have been able to find, to deploy artificial snow in either 1926 or 27. There aren't many pictures, but here's one, skiers doing the Charleston, I believe, as they come down the slopes. There's actually a film I found about kind of a year or a day in the life of Berlin, and it has a tiny, tiny, tiny snippet at the end also. A British man, supposedly working in a Swiss hotel where he probably wasn't invited back, supposedly came up with a recipe that seemed to mix crushed washing soda, sawdust, water, a layer of powdered mica, a soda soap solution. So this Schneepalast was it was only about 6 weeks. I think it was meant to be temporary. Interestingly, it was part of an exhibition called The Weekend because workers were finally getting weekends because unions had organized to get them weekends. And so this exhibition was about giving them ideas of what to do with their new free time. But one of the visitors to the Snow Palace was a skier from Vienna. He actually appeared in the Magic of the Snowshoes film we saw earlier. And he was very taken by this idea, and he took it to Vienna and opened in 1927 another Schneepalast in an abandoned train hall. This one was meant to be permanent, but its popularity did not last. The snow started to turn people's clothes brittle, their hands wrinkled, their throats got dry. It sounds delightful. But also, it was snowing outside, and it was hard to compete, right? So after 6 months, he closed it down and had to declare bankruptcy. I've thought a lot about this early effort to replicate the magic of snow. When you love something, and all the trials of snow aside, we have loved it, you want to possess it. You want constant access to it. But the power of snow was always in its resistance, its unpredictability, its wildness. And yet these palaces anticipated a world when man-made snow would be all that we have. I guess I would say we can't live in grief, but neither should we hasten out of it. The Schneepalast has also stuck with me for the perhaps silly reason that when I hear Snow Palace, I think Memory Palace, in which, a mnemonic device in which memories are kind of linked to one another. And so I keep imagining a memory palace for snow. Maybe it's a museum exhibit, even in an old train hall, filled not with fake snow, but with real artworks that were created, inspired by snow. Here are a few works that we could imagine being in there. Or maybe it's your own private museum, because people's memories of snow are as varied and infinite as snowflakes are. The point for me is to concentrate on what we're losing on every front, and by doing so, make it a little less lost. Thank you. I forgot the questions.
You're not done yet. Uh-oh.
Don't take the snow away.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
Fantastic. We'll open it up in a moment. I have one initial question and several backups in case no one's brave enough to raise hands or type in answers. The first is, there was an abundance of German examples in the videos that you showed and the pictures. Is that partially because you're here in Germany, or is that the record itself?
There I think is a deep history here for sure. And I'd say many of the themes I'm interested in all kind of run through Germany in one way or another. But also I am here, and so I both.
But
if
you were
advantage.
in France, there may be an equally
No, I actually
dense
don't
record.
think there's as much in France.
See, and that's interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you have any theories or any ideas cross your mind of why that might be? I mean, there's Germany's filled with myths and
right.
a sense of connection to nature. I don't know. Just curious if any thoughts had crossed your mind why there might be a preponderance of evidence.
That's a very good question. I mean, I do think the connection to nature, forests, mountains, these kind of elemental. It's colder here probably than France, but I think also just the thinking, even the philosophy. I mean, we talked a little bit about Heidegger, Schopenhauer. There's just. It seems more woven into the culture, but that's a good question.
Gemütlichkeit sort of like rings. So we had talked early in the semester about Heidegger has an essay in Poetry, Language, and Thought where he says that after the snow has fallen, the morning after is the time for philosophy.
It's actually, I think it's in, or maybe it's also in that, but there's one, Why I Stay in the Provinces, where he talks about I think when it's actually storming, that is the time for philosophy.
And inside, and he's in the cabin.
Yeah.
One other question that's very specific to this house. You mentioned Arnold Funk, and I was wondering if that person has a brother, or had a brother, who is related to Walter Funk, who was the Nazi Reichsminister who lived in this house.
No, different spelling, I think.
Okay. All right.
Because I think
F-U-N-K.
Yeah, no, Arnold Funk is F-A-N. It's my great German, right?
Okay.
F-A-N-C-K.
Because otherwise we would have a research project to undertake.
But I did find there's a lot of interesting history on this street.
There is a lot of interesting history in this street.
In that house, yeah.
All right. With that, I will be quiet and open it up to the floor. Peter.
Wait for the mic.
Yes, wait for the mic.
I know I have a reputation for asking the first question, so I have to make good on that. I want to ask thank you, Amy. This is really amazing talk, and I appreciate the scope and the kind of the cultural archaeology that you're doing. I'm wondering if you could say something specifically about the geography. I mean, you talked a little bit about sort of Nordic race theory, for example, but if you could talk about the geography of this, because actually it's largely a Northern Hemisphere story. It's not a Southern Hemisphere, and it's also actually largely a kind of Euro-North American story, with the exception of maybe the Himalayas and Japan. But
those are big exceptions.
Yeah,
and there's the Andes.
And the Andes.
Well.
Okay, I mean, so there may be numerous exceptions, but largely in terms of highly habitated places, we're talking about North America and Europe to a large degree. So can you, I mean, seeing as this is an institution for transatlantic dialogue, I'm wondering if there's any sort of specificity to this that is about, the Northern Hemisphere, that's about these two continents in particular, or if I'm off the mark there.
Yeah, I guess I haven't thought about it that way, only because, partly because I'm in Germany, I probably focus more on that, but I am very interested in Japan. And I feel like the Himalayas are both scientifically and culturally very underreported and written about. And so I want to make sure that that's part of the story as well. So, yeah, I mean, certainly on the race stuff, Germany and the US, it's like a baton they seem to hand back and forth, which is, no, I think, obviously it's not going to be an encyclopedia, and that's not even the kind of book I want to write at all. So, but I do want to make sure, because I think one thing that's really interesting to me is that, and this is why I kind of come back to even the sort of museum exhibit idea and could this travel around the world, because there's something very lonely, I think, about what's happening in terms of climate. And I've thought a lot about this, that, when there's a reason we have funerals, there's a reason we have rituals, and we're kind of people around the globe in very different places are kind of undergoing something very similar, and yet in isolation on some level. And so I think a lot about that. So I don't actually want to narrow it. My instinct would be to broaden it as much as possible.
Thank you. Ayanna in the back.
Hi, Amy.
Hi.
I wanted to ask a question about, and maybe this isn't a fair question, but sort of the distinction or utility of nostalgia versus mourning. And just sort of, I just kind of kept thinking about both of those things as you were giving your talk, and thinking about what passes away in climate, and also the dangers of nostalgia, that sort of thing.
No, I think that's a very interesting question, and it's something I've definitely thought a lot about. I mean, what's funny about snow, I could have talked for an hour, but I, really reined myself in. I feel like snow's always been very strongly connected with nostalgia. Both it can trigger it in people, but also it's, America, to take one example. I found a great book in the library about this. The whole idea of kind of New England and sort of these, idyllic rural villages, snow, Christmas, the white Christmas, all of that sort of came exactly as people were moving away from that. right? And it also became a way to construct a certain idea of America that, again, included some people and not others. So I think that was a very nostalgic idea, and it, became, I think, a somewhat problematic one. And sort of, I mean, I grew up like, oh, colonial Williamsburg, just sort of idealizing these places as kind of this lost America. And I think snow and winter were kind of tied into that. I mean, there's White Christmas to take the most, kind of obvious example, the song. But so yes, I'm definitely wary of nostalgia, but I also think there can be a use for it sometimes. And I think, yeah, we are going to be nostalgic on some sense. There's a great book, poetry, I think it's called The Runes of Nostalgia. And it is sort of kind of going through that idea, because it's about how do we cope with, I think people have always felt that the pace of change was relentless, but it feels especially so to us because we're living through this, but maybe it actually is also right now. So how do you strike that balance? And yes, mourning to me is different than nostalgia, because to me, nostalgia is also a somewhat false, or can be a false construction of what we had. Whereas mourning, we don't tend to get nostalgia. I guess I think about it a lot in terms of death, but I think we don't really get nostalgic for people we've loved. We mourn them, but we don't get nostalgic necessarily. And so I guess I sort of see that difference and feel, in more of the mourning camp. But as I mentioned in the talk, I think a question I'm wrestling with in the book is, last thing I'll say, can kind of mourning and resistance coexist with each other at the same time? Because there's a way you're mourning, you're accepting a loss, you're saying it's over, but we don't want to do that. And yet there is something that's over, right? So how do you kind of keep both of those things alive?
Anna.
I wanted to ask, what date you would use to clock sort of when the acknowledgement that it was truly, that snow was ceasing to be.
Mhm.
Because it's one thing to read that in the newspaper. I grew up in a place where it just dumped snow all the time and it was horrible. And I feel zero nostalgia or
Right.
mourning. But I do. I mean, I'm from New England, right?
Right.
It was awful. But I think I'm interested in, when did people start to actually actively realize that this was something that should be, like, physically realize it, not read it
Mhm.
read about it, but like notice it's not snowing anymore.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, the thing with snow is that it's always been variable.
Right.
Right.
That's what I mean.
So even now, I don't think you can say it's not snowing anymore. It's just, for me, the whole thing that started me on this project was, God, almost 5 years ago now, 65 degrees in January in New York, going into a museum and seeing a painting of snow and saying, oh my God, it used to snow. I hadn't even thought about that. So I think, but I talked to someone who lived in Maine, and she was really interesting. She said, she's very grief-stricken, is the best way I can put it. But she said it's very interesting the way people talk about it. They are very present tense. It's not snowing this year. But they'll say that every year, right? Nobody's ever coming out and saying, wow, it's really not snowing anymore. And so I think both because it still can't, I was in Utah a few years ago. It snowed like 25 inches. Sorry, I don't know the centimeter conversion in 24 hours. So it's not, you can't say it's not snowing there. But, and even scientists, as I said in the talk, it's not easy to track. But I think even for me, it's interesting because when I first started thinking about this, I was kind of like, nobody's talking about this. This is so weird. Now I feel like every week there's another story about it's not snowing. This town doesn't, is pivoting to mountain biking. It's just kind of almost feels everywhere. But that's pretty recent. But I think also because, again, when you talk to climate scientists, something kind of strange is going on the last few years. I just think there's been explanations. It goes up a certain degree, and then snow loss goes off a cliff in certain places. There's a lot of that, so it's called the snow loss cliff. But I think the past few years are especially dramatic, which is not surprising because temperatures are really going up. But there's not always a perfect correlation between temperatures, and it's the science is complicated, and I have a huge admiration for that entire community trying to sort this out and then make people pay attention.
Appropriately, I think we should call on Isa Ding, who is a political scientist working on.
She just plays one on TV.
Yes, political science is not a science. I said it.
That's what it's called.
This is fascinating, and I really can't wait to read the book. And then I'm gonna come to New York and have you sign it. If I could piggyback on Peter's question, sort of ask the question in a different way, or ask a question that's derivative from Peter's, which is that I think I sense two themes in the project, and one is the dwindling of snow and climate change, and then the other is the snow in German myths, if you will. And my question is kind of about both, but more so the second. Would it be fair to say that snow plays a distinct, important role in the cultural identity of the so-called global north due to its comparative prevalence? So then, I guess the question is, does snow evoke the same kinds of emotions, enchantment, serenity, nostalgia, melancholy, Hugh Granting Love Actually, in parts of the world where it snows less frequently, and therefore kind of features less in the fairy tales and legends? And I remember growing up in China, I was obsessed with Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales like Little Match Girl, but I sort of read that as in, it wasn't kind of part of me, but it was in my, admiration for Western, for Europe stage of my my life. So then I wonder if there's space in the book to kind of engage in this kind of dialectic, if you will, so to speak. So does the loss of snow trigger the same kind of emotions, in parts of the world where it doesn't snow as much, or are there equivalents in those parts of the world? And then is it possible that some of our nostalgia for snow, it could also be indirectly related to the cultural phenomenon of like nostalgia for the West, and nostalgia for kind of the decline of the Western culture? I wonder if there's kind of room to contemplate this question in the project.
Yeah, I mean, that's all great questions. I would say the project's not really about German myths. I just happened to pick I could have, picked from many novel. I picked the Stifter because I am in Germany, and but so it's not particularly about German myths. But I think that is an interesting question. I mean, I've become very interested in this kind of weird cultural afterlife of snow. And especially, I almost feel like the less snow there is, the more it's surfacing in TV shows and movies, and it's kind of like propagating this idea around the globe. I never thought about that in terms of, is that a kind of nostalgia? But it might become that, as snow starts to go away. There was a great podcast about this weird, again, I didn't have time to talk about this, but in the 1950s, Eastern Airlines actually flew a plane load of snow to Puerto Rico, and it landed, and then a little blonde girl got off the airplane, and they laid out like 2 tons of snow, whatever, and people played in it, and it really left like a bad aftertaste, I would say, because it felt like a colonial project of, this is Christmas, and you with your tropical climate don't actually have what you need, which frankly, I felt a little bit in Los Angeles, weirdly, So that's where I feel like this sort of New England idea that that's the real America became like a very powerful, pervasive, pernicious maybe idea. Just the interesting footnote on the Puerto Rico was, so it definitely left. There's actually an artist who's done a really interesting project based on that. A lot of people remember it and it left a bad feeling, except there were people who were going back and forth between New York and Puerto Rico who were also like, no, snow is now part of us. So yes, I think it is a mostly Northern Hemisphere thing, although I do think the Andes get left out and shouldn't. Korea, though, again, this is interesting, and I have no idea if this is like Western projection. There's this whole... Yeah. I mean, do you consider Korea kind of
So I think
part
Korea
of...
and Japan are usually considered a part of global North.
Right.
And Japan explicitly declared that they're little Europe, right?
Uh-huh.
But we're talking about averages.
Right.
Mongolia, for instance, is clearly a snowy global South country.
But it's interesting because Korea, there is this kind of also focus on snow. You know, the first kiss in every K-drama is, you know, you want to have snow. And so, but that's an interesting question. Is that kind of coming from inside, or is that a reflection of America, right? Sort of propagating that idea. So I don't know. It's a really interesting question. But no, I don't, you know, I do think there's, you know, anybody who doesn't grow up in snow is sort of fascinated by it, I think, on some level. But are you going to mourn it if it's not part of your cultural history? No. So, no, that's a great point to think about.
I guess the person right there, yeah. Hi, Amy.
Hi.
Thank you. That was a really terrific talk and so much to think about. So just sort of on the theme that Peter and Isa were talking about, I mean, it seems to me, so, you know, the historian Deepesh Chakrabarti, who's probably the most provocative post-colonial historian, has sort of made the case that when we try to think in global terms, we always have an idea of what we think the globe is. That's a cultural idea. And so every time we think of the global, in a sense, we're imposing a kind of cultural narrative on it. And so he asks us as historians to think about the planetary instead of the global. So we need to go to climate scientists, and instead of thinking about climate change as a global problem, think about it as a planetary problem. And that takes us outside culture, and it takes us to climate science, okay? But I think what I really like about your talk, in a sense, actually, is that what it's actually doing is it's showing us that even though the problem is planetary, the experience is actually local, right? And so, you know, very fundamentally, it doesn't really matter, for instance, that most people in India have never seen snow. I mean, that's okay. Though I should point out that the second richest family in India, in their 27th floor apartment building in Mumbai, which they live in, $2 billion, they have a snow room, right? So they're the so they're the only Ambanis are the only people in Bombay who know what snow is because they have it in their house. And I presume the rich will always have snow.
Right.
Well,
yeah, that's
so
yes.
you know, so everywhere they will always have snow. It's the rest of us who won't get it. But that still doesn't mean that, you know, I mean, loss has to be located in a place. Mourning can't be on a planetary scale. So as far as we're talking about human subjects, it seems to me entirely appropriate, in a sense, that you're talking about the experiences of people who live in particular cultures and cultural frameworks and are experiencing something that exists in their world that is going away, rather than a planetary transformation because of, you know, certain percentages of carbon in the atmosphere.
Right. No, that's really interesting. It's funny because I met the other day a scientist at the Institute for Climate Research who's very young American. He's from Montana. And he, you know, I sort of had this idea of, we need like this huge exhibition that can travel around the world. And he actually has, along the same lines, but been thinking very specifically about Montana and just trying to organize something there, you know, around a few specific works of art, some writers, you know, dealing with snow and the changing climate, but that it is very specific to the place. And I think, you know, the Himalayas, I mean, there's a whole other aspect of this I haven't talked about, which is the connection to mountains and snow-covered mountains. And, you know, that in a lot of places, it's a spiritual relationship, but it's a spiritual relationship predicated on kind of an ecological understanding of what snow melting and coming down from mountains. That's true in Arizona. It's true in the Himalayas, you know. So and that is a different, I grew up in LA. We kind of entrapped water from the Owens River Valley. I literally just learned, a year ago that was snowmelt. We had no relationship, right, with where our water's coming from, or we don't need to. That's the problem in the West. Other places do have that understanding and therefore a deeper relationship with the mountains, So yes, I think actually thinking about it as planetary and local is a really helpful framework.
I'm told we have time for 2 questions. Nell Painter.
Thank you, Amy. There was so much there. As you've heard from the questions, there's so much more to come and so much more we want to hear. Mostly what we've been talking about is cultural. We've been talking about emotions and nostalgia. I'd like to turn you to the material. You touched on that when you talked about the Schneepalast in Vienna and how much it cost and how the man who put it together went broke. How much do you think the cost of snow is going to affect the feelings about it?
Tell me, when you say the cost, do you mean artificial snow or actually getting to?
Mostly I'm thinking artificial snow,
Right.
because as you present it, if there are going to be, we spend a lot of time near Lake Placid, which has had 2 Olympics,
Right.
but the question is, can they ever do that again?
Right.
Probably not, because not enough. But Whiteface Mountain, they make artificial snow. And yes, artificial snow is expensive. And even, you and I both grew up in California, just thinking about the cost of, say, all that cotton,
Right.
that
yeah.
It cost money to replicate snow. And if the costs go up, and I think what you're saying, the cost would go up, is that going to change the emotions around snow?
So let me think about that for a second. The one thing I was going to say, and Abhishek or somebody, this also goes a little bit to your point. I think an interesting thing about natural snow is it is going to become a luxury good, because what's happening is lower elevation snow ski resorts, for example, are closing. Resorts at higher elevations are actually trying to build even higher so that they can keep, the very wealthy coming in. So you'll helicopter into snow, which is already a thing. One of the beauties of snow was that it was kind of a democratic thing. It snowed, everybody's outside, you can use a trash can lid, you can do whatever. And I don't know, it was an aspect of it I really loved, this kind of mixing, and that it was available for everyone. I haven't thought that much about the cost of artificial snow, except that I think, one interesting thing, all these ski resorts now are making snow. Some are flying in snow. They're trying to cover their snow. At some point, the temperatures, if they keep rising, you can make all the snow in the world you want, but you can't keep it frozen if the temperature is too warm. So it will start to become a question of return on investment, which is already what's happening. Well, it uses a lot of water. Environmentally, it's terrible to make snow. And so I also think at some point there's going to be kind of a backlash against that, because we're going to have a water crisis so many places. How do you justify making snow? A place I'm going to write about is in Arizona. There's been this 50-year battle between the Native American tribes around the San Francisco peaks, who consider the peaks sacred because they rely on deep irrigation for their farming, and they know the snow comes from the mountains. And then a resort got permission from the Forest Service to build. This was decades ago. The tribe started fighting it then. Then the resort said, well, snow's unpredictable. We want to extend our season. So then they started to make snow. And then the tribes found this objectionable, because they said, if you're making snow, what are we praying for? It's a very interesting idea. But then they said, now we're going to make snow from treated wastewater. And so because, it's cheaper and that's the available water. And you're in Arizona where they're having, they're building and building, but there's no water. So that's been like another level of the court battle. And they're saying you're polluting this mountain. And so it's just really interesting, this resort, that is sort of saying, we're open now from November to May, it's amazing. But at some point, and, these tribes have been so dogged. I mean, court case after court case after court case, none of which they've won. I mean, it's gone forward and gone forward. There was actually a Forest Service employee who quit over this because she was really upset by it. But at some point, that resort, like, it's not going to work. It's going to be too warm in Arizona even to keep the snow, the wastewater snow, whatever you've made, cold. So it's really, it's also a story of capitalism, I guess, which I think is your question at heart, right? And that snow is sort of a commodity. And at what point is that commodity just not valuable enough for the people who have a stake in it? That day will come, I think. So
one last question. Woman in the front.
I thought everything was very fascinating what you were saying, but I was thinking in terms when you were talking about Montana, on a different level. I've been twice within many years on the Inside Passage cruise to between Anchorage and Vancouver. And the first time I did it, it was already at a time where it was like 25 degrees, and they said this is unheard of, but everything was still full with snow and glaciers and you name it. And when I came the next time, this was all gone. Now, I'm not talking about nostalgia per se. I'm talking about there's a whole way of life that those communities are living, which is built upon being on permanent frost and we shouldn't forget that there's actually cultural loss, a lot of cultural loss by people that cannot live the way they used to live because of the climate changes. So even though it has global implication, it certainly has a lot of local implications. And I think it's a point in a case that you can see that global and local is very much intertwined. And I find this is, for me, even more important than to be nostalgic for the snow as such.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything last from you?
No, thank you.
All right,
Great
then please
question.
join me in applauding our speaker.